Hello and welcome to this session for the World Education Summit with me, Dr. Tina Rae. I'm going to focus today on supporting children with anxiety, stress, and with the resulting self-harm behaviours that may emanate from that. I think at the outset it's really important to frame this in the sense that we are currently in this COVID pandemic. So I will be making reference to some of the research that's just been published in terms of how children have responded to the pandemic and the effect that it may have had on some of them, a significant minority. And also, obviously, what I really want to do today is to give participants an idea as to some of the strategies, key tools and strategies that I have used throughout my career with children, young people, and with myself and adults that I support in terms of managing anxiety and stress. So just to introduce myself a wee bit, I'm a child psychologist, educational and child psychologist. I'm also a prolific author, and I have spent the last 30 years producing resources that are intended for school-based staff, parents, carers, practitioners, working with children and young people in order to promote well-being generally. My current focus clearly is on the COVID pandemic. During the first lockdown period, doing my early morning walk, I overheard a conversation between a little boy and his mummy. He was going to school because she was a key worker, and he was getting very worried. He didn't want her to go to work. He was worried that she might die. And she was very, very calm with him. But obviously, the anxiety level that he was showing was really something that made me just stop in my tracks and think we very, very much need now to be really promoting children's skills and ability to navigate this level of anxiety and to be able to manage it on a daily basis. There's obviously the potential here when you think about this child saying that he wants to stay at home, it's safer. There's something here about possible emotionally school avoidance at some stage later. So I think, in terms of actually managing those emotions, managing those feelings, those thoughts, this is the kind of support that I think many of our children are going to need going forwards. The effects of the COVID-19 pandemic are pretty evident. I think it's all over the media currently worldwide that most people are saying that we're going to have this plethora of mental health needs and issues resulting from it, and that many of our young people, the so-called COVID generation, are going to suffer profusely in both the short and longer terms. I'm slightly sceptical here because I do think that there are significant numbers who are going to be really affected quite badly. However, I just want to factor into our thinking here that this isn't all our children. We must be careful not to over-pathologise here. The Coast-based study at the University of Oxford this year, earlier on in 2020, showed us that 1/5 of children didn't feel safe to leave their homes. However, conversely, we need to think about this. 4/5 of them therefore did. So for some of our children, the lockdown periods have been a time of real growth, renewal, formulating lovely relationships with parents and carers. For others, possibly those maybe who also originally had difficulties post-pandemic, this has been a time of real stress and real anxiety. So I think we've got to be careful. This is on a continuum here. This month, February, I'm recording this in the month of February, the Prince's Trust Youth Index in the UK asked children and young people about their thoughts and feelings towards this pandemic, and there were 2,000 responded to this. 63% of 16 to 25-year-olds said that it had left them feeling always or often anxious, and 64 said they were feeling like they were missing out on being young. And I think this is a big thing, this missing out on those connections, on the nurture, on the relationships with peers, on actually just doing the stuff that young people usually do. And I think as a result of this, those children who were already prone to engaging in self-harm as a means of managing their anxiety, I'm afraid this has seen an increase. 1 in 6 children now saying that they have in some form or another engaged in self-harm behaviours during this last year, during the pandemic. And I think it's really important. I just want to focus on the language here as well, because obviously this is the real main issue. I really want our children not to feel as though they have to go down that route. I want them to feel skilled up so that they can manage their psychological pain, anxiety, without actually going to this extreme level. I don't use the term deliberate because I think that's quite pejorative in many senses. It says that a child is doing this on purpose, and they're not. Children, young people and adults who engage in self-harm doing this as a means of actually managing deep psychological pain and trauma. And I think it's really important, just the language does matter, because we don't want to demonize our young people because they take this route. We need to help and support them. What we need to be doing is understanding the underlying urge and to suggest the right kind of alternatives. For many children, it's about seeing their pain physically by the process of cutting or hurting themselves in some way. For some of them, it's this need to just calm and soothe. And that really, that cycle of cutting or hurting yourself can actually release that tension for that short period of time. So for us as adults, as practitioners working with these children, it's about us finding ways to support them and find alternatives over time to the things that are really hurting them physically or emotionally. Sometimes someone just might want to feel real, as if they exist, but ultimately I think for many children, young people and adults, it's about feeling in control. And there certainly seems to me to be a lack of control to some extent at this point in time. How do we interrupt this cycle? Usually what happens is there is this triggering event. There's something that makes me feel stressed and over anxious that I feel that I'm overwhelmed by. It leads to an unbearable sense of tension and anxiety, and then dissociation. And that's the point at which the self-injury will take place. And of course, then we'll relapse. What we need to be able to do is support the child or young person to dispute the irrational thoughts or feelings that triggering event engenders, okay? So that they're actually really thinking about, is this real? Is this really the truth? Do I really need to feel or think like this? Maybe I need to find the evidence against my thought that, maybe this is not actually really helpful to me. What we need to do with that young person in order to really break that cycle is think about exploring those big feelings. What's the source of these big feelings that seem to overwhelm me, and what can be changed? What can be managed better? How can we increase that child's capacity to cope by widening their window of tolerance, boosting resilience, and teaching healthy coping strategies? And this is the main focus of this presentation today. I want all of us to feel confident and competent in actually engaging in self-regulation activities so that we can co-regulate with our children. We can boost and build their repertoire of self-management skills. I also think a way to break the cycle involves us actually at the crisis moment, really giving that child or young person the opportunity to plan what they can do to get through that first 60 seconds when they might give in to that urge, and to do this more safely. Okay, so very, very important. Also, what else is there that might generate a similar feeling without causing harm? So there are a plethora of resources on very good websites, the Young Minds, and I think Pookie Knightsmith does a lot of work in this particular area, which actually gives alternatives. So lots and lots of literature around this. So, holding ice cubes, having a cold shower, running around the garden, just different things that will be there in that first 60 seconds so that I can get away from that immediate urge. And also, ultimately exploring that guilt and shame, and that can very often provide the motivation for change. But I do have to say, at the top end of the continuum, when children are engaging in these behaviours, these are the children who will need, coming back into the school context now after the lockdown periods, a great deal of more bespoke support and intervention. As I said earlier, I think there's an increased level of anxiety and stress for all of us at this moment in time, but notwithstanding the extreme end of the continuum and those children who already had significant mental health difficulties and are engaging in these self-harm behaviours, for many of our children and young people, this may have been a time in which they thrived. For many of them, it may have been a heightened level of anxiety that they've experienced over time, particularly with the uncertainty of, do I take GCEs? Am I going to be examined in my A-levels courses, etc., etc. But we've got to be careful not to pathologise. Let's not over-medicalise normal responses to these stressors. These are not normal stressors, so they're heightened. But for many of us, we will have a level of resilience, supportive relationships, nurturing relationships that enable us to get through. What can we do? As the grown-ups in the situation, adults, psychologists, whatever our role is, we need to understand our own traumas so that we can reflect on them. We need to find our own calm so that we can co-regulate with the child, helping them to soothe themselves, helping them to stay calm. We mustn't take their behaviour personally, because very often anxiety presents as anger, obstinacy. It can present in many different ways. We need to understand about how the brain works and how the impact of anxiety can actually impede, for example, working memory. It's not that a child has chosen not to hear what you said or do what they were told to do. They didn't actually take in the information. We need to use discipline without shaming and engage as professionals with family members and carers so that we build an anxiety management plan for the child and young person that's really going to be effective. We know what anxiety is. It's that strong, overwhelming feeling. We feel threatened. We feel scared and frightened. It's uncertainty about the future. It can last a short time or it can be prolonged. And for many of us, there's a sense that it has been far more prolonged during this pandemic. It can affect our ability to eat, sleep, just engage in normal everyday activities. And I think this is really, really important. It can take away our enjoyment of life and really control our thoughts and behaviours. Years ago, when I was working with a young woman, I asked her to describe what her anxiety felt or looked like. And she said to me, it's like a brick wall. I can't get over it. It just feels as though this is in front of me, this big brick wall. I can't move around it or over it. It's just in the way and it's just stopping me from being who I want to be and living my life. When I asked her to think about what it would look like if she could just manage maybe the first little bit of it, she could just get over that first hurdle. She described it as being like a staircase. And I think this is important. We mustn't make big goals for ourselves or our children at this point in time. We have to have small steps to success, small steps to recovery. If we're going to get from one side of the bridge, which is anxiety, to the side of the bridge, which is manageable levels of stress. Lots of triggers here, obviously. We can have specific phobias, different life events, and please don't underestimate the number of children who are going to need support, for example, with bereavement at this point in time. I spoke to one of my former students at the University of East London this week who had sadly lost 9 members of his family through this pandemic. So I think we've got to be very, very sensitive and aware and ensure that we have the right kind of bereavement support counselling in place for those children and adults. We can have a genetic predisposition to anxiety. We know this, the nature-nurture debate. Some of us are not born happy bunnies. Some of us find things a bit more worrying. You'll know when you look at your own children that one of them may be quite happy-go-lucky, and there's something called temperament. The other child won't be. The other child will always get a bit more worried about things. So I think we need to think about temperament too. But at the moment, the trigger for many of us will be this uncertainty around the COVID pandemic, the new rules, the ongoing transitions, lockdowns, the lack of connections, physical contact, and the loss of the routines and rituals that we would normally have engaged in that will trigger this level of anxiety. So what do we need to do as the adults in the situation? And I'll keep saying this because I think there's a strong and powerful role that we have now as the adults. We need to be authentic and honest. We can't lie to our children about the worries, the concerns that we have too. But what we need to do is actually frame them in a very coherent way, a very honest, authentic way, but also pointing to how we do keep ourselves safe. The facts and the fictions around this, okay, the mythology around vaccinations, etc., etc. We need to be very clear. What is the evidence here? We need to take the time to talk and talk through those worries, not dismissing them because we think that they're silly or we think that they're not important. If I am worried about giving the virus to my friend and I'm 9, if I'm worried that I have lost lots of learning and my reading's not as good as it was before, I need that to be listened to. I don't need a one-size-fits-all solution, but I need my voice to be heard here. So we mustn't dismiss. We need to be curious and help them to analyse and gently challenge and reframe some of those negative automatic thoughts that they may be experiencing on a daily basis. And ultimately, it's about providing safety and nurture. So walking through, our language really matters. We need the child to know that we are there to keep them safe, okay? We are their safe haven. So is the school, so is the home, hopefully. So actually the language that we use is really, really important. I'm here for you, I'm staying here, you're going to be okay, I'm with you, I'm looking after you. Making sure they understand the physiology. This will pass, okay? Your body's responding in an anxious way. Just give it a couple of minutes, it's going to go. You'll get through it. You've been through it before. You've managed this before. You'll be able to do it again. And then validation that, you know, this must be really hard for you. I'm sorry it's making you feel this way. It's really difficult, but let's talk it through. I'm not dismissing it. I know it's not silly that you feel like this. It's quite normal. Let's normalize it. How can we help? How can we work out a plan together so that we can manage it together? There are 8 keys to this, that things that we can all do in terms of reducing anxiety on a daily basis. Structure and routine, ensuring that things are as similar, the same as they possibly can be, knowing that I've been given pre-warnings of what's going to change, what's going to happen next, because at this moment in time, I need to feel more in control, and that really helps. Children and young people will need opportunities to exercise, play, and engage in free activities on a daily basis, just getting together, connecting again, feeling that they can actually go out and increase their level of endorphins in that process. Quality time together, and limiting access to news, which can be really, really harmful. I'm very worried about the current dynamic in terms of what children are being told. I don't want this to be a self-fulfilling prophecy that every child is going to have a mental health problem. We're all going to be behind. You are the COVID generation, the lost children. It's very, very important that we call them what they also are, which is courageous, resilient. You can get through this. Look how well you've done this year. Look how you've managed, notwithstanding all the difficulties. Now let's look at what we all need now as individuals and as a group together and see how we can get there. Maintaining those relationships, focusing on the positives, absolutely essential, but also as the adults in the situation, we need to be very careful and clear. We look after ourselves as well. We have to engage in a level of self-nurture that's going to ensure that we can share our calm with our children. Unregulated, dysregulated adults cannot support or nurture unregulated, dysregulated children. It's an impossibility. So finding our calm first before we can share it is essential. So don't for any moment think that self-care is really selfish. It's an essential. So developing their personal anxiety support plan. Every child at the moment, I think, would benefit from this. And I think it's really important advice that we would give them. It's not about what works for anyone else. It's about what works for you. My plan is what my plan is. The tools that I want to use are the ones that I know work for me because I've tried them out. I've learned them. That's really important. Please don't think everyone, for example, can do mindfulness. Many ASD children on the continuum that I've worked with, have found mindfulness extremely difficult, particularly in a group. You can't ask children to shut their eyes and feel insecure in the classroom context with other children. It can trigger elements of PTSD for some. So be very clear, it's about what works for that child. There's no right or wrong answers. If something works for you as a child, you write it down, even if it feels a bit weird. And you be specific as possible in terms of writing down the things that would help you. Because I think this is really, really important. And also flexible. You adapt and change. So you try something out, it works a wee bit. You try it out, it works better, it doesn't work so well. You reflect on that, you review it, and you tweak it, you adapt it, you try something new if it doesn't work for you. So just a quick framework for this, basically, I can identify what my triggers are, what makes it worse, what helps or when it's not quite so bad. So those exceptions, what small steps can I take right now? What 3 things can I do, again, in the first 60 seconds to calm myself straight away? What are my strategies? And then thinking about things I can do every day to look after my well-being. So activity scheduling, for example. I'm going to talk through some of these now. People I can go to for help, and then listing any websites, helplines or text lines that the child or young person may find helpful. And it's really important that at least one of those sources is available 24/7 because you never know when you might need the additional support. And again, building the toolbox, and this is crucial. All the different things, and I'm definitely a positive psychologist. I look for what works and I look to build on people's strengths. I don't look for deficits. So I think it's really, really important. This is the focus here. What works for you as a child or young person? I'm going to talk through some of the strategies that I would place in my own toolbox, and I would support children in maybe trying out for themselves to see if they are appropriate for them. Our task ultimately is to create and resource what I would call a recovery curriculum. And it's not a recovery in terms of everyone needs a mental health toolbox. It's a recovery in the sense that we all need, again, to get connected, to feel safe, to feel secure, to feel nurtured. We need to now focus on our well-being so that we can then engage in academic learning again once we are self-regulated and calm. Now, for some, that's going to be relatively easy for our more resilient children. For others, it's going to be quite difficult. So we need to be ensuring that we are trauma informed here. And I'm going to make reference to my most recent publication, which I wrote in the first lockdown period of this pandemic last year, because I was so aware of the need to provide help straight away to parents, carers, teachers, young people who needed helpful strategies, activities, tools at their fingertips so that they could actually manage the anxiety of this whole situation. There is a need then for all of us to engage in what I call the 3 trauma recovery approaches. And I'm going to go through each of these in turn. And this is actually the framework by which I undertook to write this particular publication. So, self-regulate for well-being, identifying and modulating our emotions, controlling impulses, delaying gratification, making thoughtful and conscious choices and setting goals that we can achieve. So self-regulate, absolutely essential. Are we modelling this now to our children? Are we able to do this? Emotional self-control, cognitive self-control, regulation, boiling down to our emotion, problem-solving skills. And social self-control, our capacity to refrain from just saying whatever pops into our heads. Okay, so being more thoughtful, empathetic. So emotional, cognitive and social, are we modelling it to our children, young people? I think it's really important that we start with ourselves. We think about how we self-regulate. Is it that simple? I actually think it's like any other set of skills. You get better at it the more that you do it. We need to be really honing up on our skills. So the deep breathing, it sounds corny, but actually it's a natural response when we're stressed to take those short breaths that, you know, just they're too high up actually. They're too shallow. So we need to breathe deeply, just stop. We need to drink more water. Our nervous systems are far more sensitive when we're dehydrated. We know this. We need to just stop, pause. Hand on heart, just breathe. Throughout the day, again and again and again, I find myself doing this 4, 5, 6 times sometimes. And we need to think sometimes, if, you know, we're having a problem with a child, we're feeling stressed, they're stressed, we're kind of displacing it on each other. We need to recall what we love about the child or young person and a successful experience that we may have had with them. And I think that's really important because that releases these positive neurotransmitters which balance out the negative brain chemicals which are produced by frustration, stress and anxiety. We can self-regulate our own nervous systems. We can visualize a positive outcome in our minds and practice this on a daily basis. But again, I'm reinforcing here that these skills need to be practiced. We need to actually consistently use them on a daily basis if we're going to build up our toolbox effectively. Calm down jar, I use this with children, young people. Again, I'm not going to go into too much detail. You have the slide here. Very, very easy to do. Now, all of these different strategies I'm now going to show you briefly come from my toolbox of wellbeing. And you know, if you just go online, you can download lots and lots of resources. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 method. So working backwards from 5, using your senses. So for example, I might list 5 things I can hear, 4 I can see, 3 I can touch, 2 I can smell, 1 I can taste, etc. It just stops you. It's a grounding mechanism. Visualization, picturing yourself, gathering the emotions up, scrunching them up and putting them into a box. Walking, swimming, biking or jogging away the painful feelings. Really, really important. Turning the channel, imagining that, visualizing this in your head. Again, it doesn't work for all of us, but for many of our younger children, visualization activities are really, really useful. Get moving mentally and physically for well-being. It's absolutely crucial, this. We know about the feel-good chemicals that exercise produces. So really, really important. And also about staying agile in our heads and challenging our negative automatic thoughts. So for example, I use lots of tools from cognitive behaviour therapy. You don't need to be a therapist to do this. You just have to learn how to use these therapeutic tools. And in my view, as a psychologist, I think this is common sense. We know lots of us, we engage in these thinking errors, doing ourselves down, catastrophizing, blowing it out of proportion, thinking that we're going to fail, getting over emotional. We set ourselves up by, you know, setting targets that are unrealistic for ourselves, or we blame ourselves. Oh, that went wrong. It must be down to me. It must be my fault. I get children, young people, test the evidence. What's the evidence for it? What's the evidence against it? What would my best friend or someone who loves me say if they heard my thought? What would my teachers say? What would my parents or carers say? What would I say to my best friend if he or she had this thought? Now, at this point, if you go through this process logically, and I'm writing all this down usually for the child, at this point, that's when a cognitive shift can take place, because the moment you ask people to give advice to others, they're very good at it usually. So I would write down what the child is going to say here. And usually that's the script I then say to them, well, why don't you say that to yourself? Why don't you put that on the post-it note? Why don't you put that on your little self-help card in your plan, so that next time you have this thought, you say that to yourself? Because actually, what we believe about ourselves is not always true. We need to know that our thoughts, our beliefs are not always accurate. We need to challenge them. And it's a great life skill that we could all do with learning and sharing and developing on a daily basis. Physical fitness, being in nature, really, really important. We know it lowers anxiety. We know it's got a really positive impact on mental, physical health. Vitamin D releases serotonin. The outdoors relieves stress and anxiety. So absolutely essential that kids have more of this as we go forward from this pandemic. I also think sometimes it's useful to say, look, I'm going to have dedicated worry time. I come in from school, I'm stressed out, I feel I'm a bit overwhelmed, or I'm not at school, but I still feel this way. What do? I'm going to sit down, I'm 7 years old. Let's have some worry time. Let's write all those worries down. Then we're going to go out and do something lovely together. We're going to play in the garden. We're going to walk the dog, whatever it is. We're going to say it. We're going to shelve it, but then we're going to come back to it and we're going to sort it out. We'll sit down together. We'll look at those worries that you wrote down, and then we'll go through them and problem solve. Facing my fears using the anxiety ladder. I use this always with children who have emotionally based school avoidance. And I think it's really, really important. What we want to do, and think about back to my visual image at the start about anxiety being the brick wall and then having the staircase. This is a bit like the staircase. I put at the bottom of my ladder the least provoking element of this, the least anxiety provoking element, and I stage it all the way up, because what I want to do is to get through this step process. Okay, I want to build up good evidence over time that I can be with that feared object. Those fears are not there forever. We can do something about them. So it's step by step by step by step. Very important, small steps. ACT. I love this acronym. On a daily basis, positive psychology. Let's work out what we're going to do. Active things, calming things, thinking things. Okay, so running, swimming, singing, mindfulness, relaxation tools, grounding, visualization, thinking ones, challenging my negative thoughts. What could I do? And I get the kids to do an ACT diary for a week, working out what worked well, what didn't work quite so well, what would they need now to develop more of in order to keep themselves better mentally, emotionally. I also love this concept of flow, that notion that when you're completely immersed in an activity, you don't notice time passing. Usually it's creative or sporting. Very important that on a daily basis, we and our children now experience some element of flow. I paint, I walk, I do lots of things on a daily basis that ensure that I have this flow time. I think it's essential now. Again, we factor this into our daily schedules. Connecting for well-being. We know connections matter. We know that we all want to be connected to each other. That's how human beings are engineered. That's how we're built. It has a contagious effect, and it's absolutely essential that we really, really do build those meaningful reactions and rebuild those associations that we've had with each other over time and in the past. Absolutely essential. When children are coming back into school at this point in time, we need to be thinking very clearly about how we support them to look at the positives, what really went well, and think about the good times that we had in the past, the happy memories, because we're going to have them again. It's very important. So making a happy memories box or book is really, really lovely thing to do. And also another key strategy from positive psychology, I do engage in this 3 kind acts on a daily basis. They're not random. I plan them. It's really important to focus away from me to someone else, to do good out there, doing things that make other people feel happy and loved. Really important, small things. And I get the children to do this and record their kind acts on a daily basis. Think about it. What difference did that make? How do you feel that your acts have impacted on other people? And focusing as well on social media. It's not all negative. During this pandemic, I'm aware of some of the teenagers in my local area who've been getting together doing a kind messages WhatsApp group. I think this is lovely. Okay, trying to keep each other going, supporting each other, particularly through the process of actually studying when they know they're not going to have exams. And lots of them have felt very, very anxious about that. So very important. So my takeaway key messages, I suppose, at this point in time, is that we really focus on safety and nurture first and move away from this notion that children can academically catch up when they're not regulated. But also very important that we ask the children what they want. The voice of the child has to be paramount here. So I do think it's important to ask them, what is it that you're most worried about? What do you want help with? What would help you the most at this point in time? Nurture, structure and building relationships are key here. And we must have also taken the time to process our own trauma experiences and our own anxieties. We need to find our calm. So there's a real need here for the wellbeing leads in schools in particular to take a lead in ensuring that staff have opportunities for peer support, whether that's peer group supervision, support networks, whatever it is, but also that, we factor into our thinking that staff too will need time to be nurtured going forwards, and some will need more than others. Again, it's a continuum. Let's not stigmatise anyone because they need more help than we do. We need to avoid re-traumatising children by focusing overly on the negatives and sharing these continually. Yes, we have to address them, but for some children there will need to be a more bespoke intervention if they've been bereaved, if they have a diagnosis of anxiety disorder, or if they are showing or displaying high levels of anxiety. Let's focus on what helped us to cope in lockdowns, in online learning, and build on this. We still have to be physically distant. We still have to adhere to all the rules around this. It's absolutely, clearly an essential, but we can remain emotionally connected. Making sure that our most vulnerable get the right support at the outset is absolutely essential. We don't all need a therapeutic intervention for anxiety. We need to understand that every conversation that we have can be a therapeutic one. Just to walking along the corridor, talking to someone about how we both manage feeling a bit worried or anxious and what we're worried about, how we can share strategies, etc. Every conversation in itself can be an intervention, in my view. But let's ultimately listen to what the children say. Let's not demonise those who need more support. Let's really get to grips with the fact that some will need additional support for anxiety, but many of them will just need some support to catch up on their learning, to get back together again, to socialise. And many of them will be saying, I'd like a bit more time to play with my friends. I'd like a bit more time just to be together and feel happy. So let's think about this very carefully and ensure, in order to manage the anxiety, that we all have trauma-sensitive classrooms and practice, and focus now on nurture for all. Thank you very much for listening. Please do follow me on Twitter. I often post resources and ideas that I think will be helpful to parents, teachers, carers and psychologists. So thank you very, very much for listening, and I hope that this has been helpful. Bye-bye.